The silence in the executive elevator wasn't empty. It was pressurized, heavy with the specific weight of things left unsaid. I had a rule, etched into the lining of every tailored suit I owned. Control, above all else. Emotions were liabilities, and I didn't carry debt. But then the car shifted, a mechanical hiccup that threw gravity off kilter. The digital numbers flickered, 38, 39, 40, and Cass's hand swung out to steady herself. Her knuckles grazed my palm. It wasn't a grip, it was a graze, fleeting and accidental. Yet the heat of it traveled up my arm with the velocity of a margin call. My breath hitched, a sharp, traitorous sound in the quiet. In that single electric moment, the professional distance I had spent 10 years fortifying didn't just crack. It evaporated. To understand why that touch mattered, you have to understand the architecture of my life before she arrived. I am a senior partner at Sterling & Vance, a firm where the walls are made of glass and the people are made of steel. The office was my sanctuary, a landscape of muted grays and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a city that looked like a circuit board. I could exist safely there, behind the armor of my reputation. I was the strategist who saw the board 3 moves ahead. Emotional detachment wasn't a flaw. It was my competitive advantage. Then came the merger, and with it, the transfer from the London office. Cass. She didn't just enter a room. She disrupted its entire ecosystem. I remember the first time I saw her. It was a Tuesday strategy meeting, the kind that usually ran on a script of polite aggression and corporate jargon. The door opened 5 minutes late, an offense I usually found unforgivable, and there she was. She wasn't wearing the standard issue armor. Her blazer was unbuttoned, revealing a silk shirt that moved like water, and her hair had a texture that suggested she'd spent the morning in the wind rather than a salon. She carried a coffee cup instead of a briefcase, and wore a confidence that didn't ask for permission to exist. Most people walk into Sterling & Vance with their guards up, eyes scanning for threats. Cass walked in like she owned the building. Or perhaps like she didn't care who did. She took the empty seat across from me, the leather creaking under the shift of her weight. When our eyes met, I expected the usual assessment, the quick calculation of rank and utility. Instead, I found amusement. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, and lit with a spark of defiance that felt dangerously personal. She didn't look at me like a senior partner. She looked at me like a riddle she had already solved. "You must be Elena," she said, her voice carrying a rasp that felt out of place in the sterile acoustics of the boardroom. It wasn't a greeting. It was an observation. "I've heard you're the one to beat." The room went silent. In our world, rivalry was conducted in subtext, in the fine print of contracts and the subtle maneuvering of leverage. We didn't announce it. But Cass wasn't playing by the local rules. She leaned back, one arm draped over the chair, exposing the line of her throat, completely at ease in a room designed to induce stress. I felt a prickle of irritation, hot and unfamiliar, rise beneath my collar. She was chaotic variables introduced into my perfect equation. She was messy. She was unpredictable. And she was looking at me with an intensity that made the air between us feel thick, viscous. I straightened my spine, adjusting the cuffs of my blouse, retreating into the safety of protocol. "I'm the one who runs this division," I corrected, my voice cool, clipped. "And we value punctuality here." Cass just smiled, a slow, languid expression that didn't look apologetic in the least. "I value results," she countered, her gaze dropping to my hands for a split second before returning to my eyes. "I think we'll find we have different definitions of value, Elena." That was the beginning. It wasn't just a clash of styles. It was an invasion. She challenged my data with intuition and my logic with gut instinct. And the worst part wasn't that she was annoying. The worst part was that she was brilliant. She saw angles I missed. She read clients like they were open books. She was a threat, not just to my position, but to the carefully curated numbness I had cultivated for years. Every time she was near, the temperature in the room seemed to rise, a sensory intrusion I couldn't regulate. I told myself I hated her. I told myself she was a liability to be managed. But my body, traitorous and alive, was already beginning to tell a different story. The Kensington merger was the whale of the quarter. A deal so complex it required a war room atmosphere. That Tuesday, the boardroom felt less like a meeting place and more like a gladiatorial arena. The air conditioning hummed, a low, persistent drone that usually helped me focus. But today, it felt like static interference. I stood at the head of the mahogany table, my presentation projected on the glass wall behind me. Charts, projections, risk assessments, my armor. I was outlining the conservative approach, a strategy built on historical data and guaranteed returns. It was flawless. It was safe. The numbers don't support an aggressive acquisition here, I stated, my voice steady, authoritative. I pointed to the volatility index on the screen. We minimize exposure. We wait for Q3. From the other end of the table, a pen tapped against the wood. Tap, tap, tap. A rhythmic interruption that grated against my nerves like sandpaper. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Cass was leaning back in her chair, that same maddening ease in her posture. She wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking at me. Minimizing exposure is just a polite way of saying, we're scared, Cass said. Her voice was low, but it cut through the room like a serrated knife. She stopped tapping the pen and spun it between her fingers, a blur of movement that drew my eye. You're playing defense, Elena, but the market isn't attacking us. It's waiting for us. I turned slowly, placing my hands flat on the table. The cold varnish grounded me. We have a fiduciary duty to protect the client's assets, Cass. Not to gamble them on a hunch. It's not a hunch, she countered, leaning forward now, elbows on the table. The shift in proximity, even across 10 feet of mahogany, felt significant. It's instinct. The data tells you where the market has been. It doesn't tell you where it's going. You're driving, looking in the rearview mirror. The room held its breath. The junior analysts looked between us like spectators at a tennis match, terrified and thrilled. This wasn't just about the Kensington deal anymore. It was about how we lived. I built walls, she built bridges. I hoarded control, she spent it. And you'd drive us off a cliff just to see the view, I shot back. Cass smiled, a slow, dangerous expression that didn't reach her eyes but lingered on her mouth. Maybe I trust my ability to handle the fall better than you do. The subtext hit me in the chest. She wasn't talking about the merger. She was talking about me. About the rigidity of my posture, the buttoned-up collar of my shirt, the way I structured my life to avoid any possibility of a crash. She was challenging the very architecture of my control. I looked at her, really looked at her. The fluorescent lights caught the sharp angle of her jaw, the way a stray lock of hair fell over her eye, which she brushed away with an impatient hand. For a second, the boardroom dissolved. It was just us. Two opposing forces locked in a silent, static orbit. I felt a flush of heat rise up my neck, not from anger, but from the terrifying realization that she saw me. Not the senior partner title, not the reputation, but the woman beneath it, who was terrified of making a mistake. We stick to the strategy, I said, my voice tighter than I intended. We mitigate risk. Risk is the price of entry, Cass murmured, her gaze holding mine, unflinching. If you never risk anything, Elena, you never actually win. You just survive. The meeting dragged on for another hour, a grueling back and forth of logistics and legalities, but the energy had shifted. Every time I spoke, I felt her listening, not just to the words, but to the cadence, the pauses. She was mapping me. And God help me, I was mapping her too. I noticed the way her fingers drummed on her notebook when she was impatient. I noticed the specific shade of her eyes, not just brown, but the color of espresso without milk, dark, bitter, intense. By 6 p.m., the junior associates had filed out, exhausted. By 7 p.m., the other partners had gone home. The cleaning crew came and went, the hum of the vacuum cleaner, a temporary distraction. The city outside the windows turned from gray to a glittering grid of gold and obsidian. And still, we sat there. The argument had evolved into a silent war of attrition. Neither of us was willing to yield the room. Neither of us was willing to leave the other alone in the space. The silence of a corporate high-rise at midnight is a specific kind of intimacy. It's not the peaceful quiet of a home. It's a pressurized, hum-filled void. By 11 p.m., the cleaning crews had moved on to the lower floors, leaving the 40th floor in a state of suspended animation. The overhead fluorescents had clicked off hours ago, replaced by the amber glow of the city bleeding in through the floor-to-ceiling glass and the sharp blue-white pools of light from our desk lamps. We were the only two living things in a tower of steel, suspended in the dark sky like astronauts in a capsule. We had moved from the boardroom to the war room, a smaller, more enclosed space where the walls felt like they were inching closer with every passing hour. The Kensington files were spread out between us like the map of a conquered territory. Stacks of due diligence reports, financial audits, and legal briefs. For hours, the only sounds were the rustle of paper, the aggressive clatter of fingers on keyboards, and the occasional sigh of frustration. It should have been tedious. It should have been exhausting. But the air in the room was charged with a static electricity that kept sleep at bay. Every time I reached for a document, I was hyper-aware of where her hand was. Every time she shifted in her chair, the sound of fabric moving against leather seemed to echo in the hollowness of the room. We were working side by side now, the antagonism of the afternoon softening into a weary camaraderie born of necessity. You can't maintain a Cold War when you're sharing a foxhole, and that's what this deal had become. A mutual enemy we had to defeat together. You missed a zero in the liability column on page 42, Cass murmured, not looking up from her screen. Her voice was rougher now, stripped of the performative polish she wore for the partners. It was a bedroom voice, low and textured, wasted on a spreadsheet. I didn't bristle at the correction. I just corrected it. Good catch, I admitted, my eyes burning. That would have been messy. Messy is my brand, remember? She chuckled, a soft, vibrating sound. She pushed her chair back then, the wheels rolling heavily over the plush carpet. With a groan that was entirely human and unguarded, she kicked off her heels. The sound of them hitting the floor, thud, thud, felt shockingly illicit. In my world, you didn't take your shoes off until you were behind the double locks of your own front door. Seeing her bare feet, the arch of her foot flexing as she stretched, felt like seeing a secret. She reached up and pulled the band from her hair, letting it fall in a dark, chaotic wave around her shoulders. She unbuttoned the top button of her silk shirt, exhaling a long breath that seemed to release the tension of the entire day. I found myself watching her, my pen hovering uselessly over a profit margin analysis. She looked undone. She looked real. The corporate shark was gone, replaced by a woman who was tired, hungry, and beautiful in a way that made my chest ache. I ordered food, she said, catching me staring. If she noticed the intensity of my gaze, she didn't comment on it. She just pointed to a brown paper bag that had been sitting on the console table, forgotten in the fray. Thai, probably cold by now. We ate out of the cartons with plastic forks, sitting on the floor because the table was too cluttered with the wreckage of the merger. It was absurd. Two women in suits that cost more than most cars, eating pad thai on the floor of a skyscraper in the middle of the night. Why do you do it? Cass asked suddenly, stabbing a piece of tofu. The long hours, the armor, the terrifying perfectionism. I looked at the city lights, a sea of anonymous ambition. Control, I said simply. If I control the variables, I can't be blindsided. If I'm perfect, I'm safe. Safe sounds boring, she countered, looking at me over the rim of the carton. And lonely. It's efficient. It's a cage, Elena. She leaned in then, reaching for a napkin near my knee. The movement brought her into my personal space, collapsing the distance I had carefully maintained all night. Suddenly, I couldn't smell the Thai food. I could only smell her. It was a scent I was beginning to learn against my will. Sandalwood, something sharp like ozone or rain, and the warm, biological scent of skin. It invaded my lungs, a sensory takeover that made my head swim. She didn't pull back immediately. She stayed there, her face inches from my shoulder, her hand brushing the fabric of my trousers. The air between us thickened, heavy with the weight of everything we weren't saying. I could hear the rhythm of her breathing, slightly elevated, matching my own. We should finish, I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. The elevator shuts down for maintenance at midnight. Cass lingered for a heartbeat longer, her dark eyes searching mine, before she pulled back. Right, she said softly. Strictly business. But as we packed up the files, the air wasn't professional anymore. It was thick, suspended, waiting for the exhale. The walk to the elevator bank was a study in synchronized movement. We moved down the corridor in silence, our heels clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm that sounded too much like a countdown. I pressed the call button. The light glowed a harsh, clinical white. When the doors slid open, revealing the mirrored interior of the executive lift, I stepped inside with the kind of rigid posture I usually reserved for board meetings. Cass followed, and the doors hissed shut, sealing us in a box of steel and polished chrome. The descent from the 40th floor takes exactly 45 seconds. I know this because I have timed it. I time everything. It is a habit born of a need to quantify my existence, to measure the passing of my life in manageable, billable increments. But tonight, the mechanism felt sluggish. The digital numbers above the door, 39, 38, 37, seemed to bleed into one another, moving with the viscosity of oil. We stood shoulder to shoulder, facing forward, watching our own reflections in the brushed metal doors. In the glass of the office, I was the senior partner, and she was the disruption. Here, in the suspended capsule, the hierarchy dissolved. There were no desks to hide behind, no assistants to interrupt, no ringing phones to break the tension. There was just the hum of the cables and the terrifying proximity of her body. I kept my eyes fixed on the floor numbers, counting them down like a diver watching an oxygen gauge. 30, 29, 28. The quiet wasn't empty. It was heavy with the ghost of the conversation we'd just had, with the lingering warmth of the Thai food we'd eaten on the floor, and with the electric proximity of her body that seemed to consume all the available oxygen in the car. I could hear the shift of her breathing, a slow, steady rhythm that felt maddeningly calm compared to the rapid-fire staccato of my own heart. I tightened my grip on my leather portfolio, my knuckles turning white, trying to summon the fortress I usually lived behind. Then, the universe tested that theory. Somewhere between the 20th and 19th floors, the car shuddered. It wasn't a catastrophic failure, just a mechanical hiccup, a sudden, violent jolt as the braking system recalibrated. The floor seemed to drop out from under us for a fraction of a second before catching itself with a metallic groan. Physics took over. My heels, perfect for projecting authority but terrible for stability, betrayed me. I stumbled, my center of gravity shifting dangerously to the left. I reached out blindly for the handrail, but I didn't find cold metal. I found Cass. Or rather, she found me. Her reaction was instantaneous, a reflex born of instinct rather than thought. Her hand shot out, catching me by the waist to steady me. It was a firm, solid grip, her fingers splaying wide across the wool of my blazer, her thumb pressing into the curve of my hip. The car stabilized with a final shuddering thud, resuming its smooth descent. But the world had already tilted on its axis. She didn't let go. That was the breach. The jolt had passed. I was steady on my feet. Protocol dictated that she release me immediately, that we both mutter a polite apology and retreat to our respective corners. But she didn't move. Her hand remained on my waist, a heavy, anchoring weight that burned through the layers of silk and wool. It wasn't a grab anymore. It was a hold. I turned my head slowly, looking at her. She wasn't looking at the numbers. She was looking at me. Her eyes were dark, dilated in the low light of the elevator, stripped of all the irony and amusement she usually wore like armor. For the first time, I saw something raw there. A question. A challenge. "You okay?" she asked. Her voice was low, a vibration that I felt in my chest as much as I heard in my ears. "I'm fine," I whispered. The words were automatic, a lie I told out of habit. I wasn't fine. I was hyper-aware of the exact pressure of her fingertips, of the heat radiating from her palm, of the way her body was angled toward mine, shielding me from a danger that had already passed. The air between us charged, thickening into something tangible. My mantra, strictly business, dissolved into static. I should have stepped away. I should have removed her hand. But I didn't. For 3 seconds, 3 lifetimes, I leaned into her touch, just a fraction of an inch. A silent admission. A surrender. Then the bell dinged. The sound was sharp, piercing the bubble of intimacy like a needle. The door slid open, revealing the cavernous, empty lobby, flooded with the cold blue light of the street lamps outside. The spell broke. Cass's hand fell away from my waist, the loss of contact leaving a physical coldness on my side. We stepped out into the lobby, the marble expanse returning us to our roles. "See you Monday, Elena," she said. She didn't look back. She just walked toward the revolving doors, her coat billowing slightly behind her. "Monday," I echoed to the empty air. I drove home in silence, but the sensation of her hand on my waist lingered. It haunted me. Through the entire weekend, in the safety of my apartment, I could still feel the phantom weight of her touch, a brand I couldn't wash off. I had spent a decade building walls to keep people out, but as I lay in bed that Sunday night, staring at the ceiling, I realized the terrifying truth. Cass hadn't just climbed the wall. She had found the door. And for one reckless second in a descending elevator, I had left it unlocked. The annual Sterling and Vance Charity Gala is less about philanthropy and more about a tax-deductible display of dominance. It is a performance review, conducted in black tie. I stood on the periphery of the ballroom, holding a glass of sparkling water like a shield, wearing a high-necked column of midnight blue velvet. It was armor designed to deflect attention, to keep the world at a manageable distance. But armor is useless if the weapon is already inside the gates. I saw Cass before she saw me. In the office, she was a study in chaotic tailoring. Here, she was a revelation. She wore a slip of emerald silk that seemed to defy physics, clinging to her frame like a second skin. It was backless, an expanse of golden skin exposed to the cool air, a vulnerability that felt shockingly aggressive. She moved through the crowd with a fluid, predatory grace, charming the chairman, laughing at unfunny jokes. For the first time, seeing someone else win the room didn't make me competitive. It made me hungry. A dark, possessive thread pulled tight in my chest. I wanted to walk over, wrap my hand around her waist, reclaiming the spot she had touched in the elevator, and steer her away from the prying eyes of the donors. Needing to escape the visual overstimulation, I turned and slipped through the French doors onto the terrace. The night air was sharp and crisp. The balcony was empty, a quiet reprieve. I gripped the cold stone railing, breathing in the smell of the city, trying to find the cool, hard center of myself that Cass had displaced. "Hiding, Elena?" The voice came from the shadows, low and amused. I turned around slowly. Cass was leaning against the archway, a glass of red wine in her hand. The wind caught the hem of her dress, rippling the silk. In the half-light, she looked less like a colleague and more like a siren. "Strategizing," I corrected, though the word sounded hollow. "The acoustics inside are terrible." "The acoustics are fine," she said, walking toward me. The sound of her heels on stone was a slow, deliberate tempo. "You just don't like not being the smartest person in the room." "And you think you are?" "I think I'm the only one who knows why you're really out here." She stopped 3 feet away, close enough for me to smell that sandalwood perfume mixed with the night air. "Inside, you have to be the senior partner. Out here, you're just the woman who almost let me catch her in an elevator." The reference hit me like a physical blow. "That was a mechanical failure," I said, my defense weak. "Was it?" Cass tilted her head. Her gaze dropped to my mouth, a tactile look. "Because it felt like a structural one." "Cass," I warned, but there was no bite in it. She closed the final distance. She didn't touch me. She didn't have to. She stood close enough that the heat radiating from her bare skin bridged the gap. I could feel the warmth of her breath, the magnetic pull of her presence. My hands tightened on the railing behind me, trapping me between the stone and the storm. "Tell me to go back inside," she whispered, her voice a challenge. "Tell me this is strictly business. Tell me you don't feel the current running between us." I opened my mouth to recite the logic that had kept me safe for a decade, but all I could look at was the curve of her lower lip. The terrifying realization that if she leaned in 1 inch more, I wouldn't push her away. I would pull her closer. The word fractured. "Elena, there you are." The voice was loud, cheerful, and oblivious. We sprang apart. The door swung open, spilling yellow light onto the terrace. It was Marcus, a junior associate, grinning. "The chairman is asking for you. Big toast coming up." Cass turned away, gripping her glass until her knuckles turned white. I looked at Marcus, forcing a polite smile that felt like a grimace. "I'm coming," I said. My voice was steady, but my blood was roaring. I walked past Cass without looking at her, but as I crossed the threshold, I felt the loss of her proximity like a phantom limb. The interruption hadn't dispelled the tension. It had pressurized it, turning a spark into a bomb waiting for a fuse. Monday morning didn't bring relief. It brought a suffocation that felt entirely new. The office, usually a sanctuary of cool air and sterile surfaces, now felt like a pressure cooker. The ghost of the gala, the almost touch on the balcony, the heat of Cass's skin in the elevator, hung in the corridors like a thick fog. I tried to bury myself in the quarterly projections, but the numbers wouldn't stay still. Every time I looked at a spreadsheet, I saw the curve of her neck. Every time my phone buzzed, my pulse spiked with a Pavlovian hope that it was her. It was pathetic. It was unprofessional. It was a complete failure of the discipline I prided myself on. By Wednesday, the tension had metastasized into something volatile. We were reviewing the final terms of the Kensington acquisition in my office. The door was closed, but the blinds were open, a glass fishbowl exposed to the entire floor. Cass was pacing. She wore a charcoal suit today, sharp and severe, but she had rolled the sleeves up to her elbows, exposing the tendons in her forearms. She was arguing for a clause I considered suicidal. "You're trying to strangle the deal before it even breathes," she snapped, tossing a file onto my desk. The papers slid across the mahogany, stopping inches from my hand. "This indemnity cap is insulting. They'll walk." "They won't walk if they want the capital," I countered, not looking up from my monitor. I was using the screen as a shield. "We need protection against their liabilities. I'm not exposing this firm to a lawsuit because you want to play hero." "I'm not playing hero. I'm playing to win." She stopped pacing and leaned over my desk, planting both hands on the wood. "You're so obsessed with not losing that you've forgotten what winning looks like. You're paralyzed, Elena." I looked up then. The accusation hit a nerve that was already raw. "I am prudent," I said, my voice rising, abandoning the cool modulation I usually maintained. "I'm the reason this division exists. While you're throwing darts at a board and calling it intuition, I'm the one ensuring we have a floor to stand on." "Is that what you call this?" She laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Standing? You're hiding. You're hiding behind your data, behind your desk, behind this terrifying need to be untouchable." "I am not hiding." I stood up, my chair rolling back with a violent clatter. We were shouting now, voices raised, chests heaving. It was unprofessional. It was messy. It was exactly what I never allowed. But beneath the anger, there was something else, a desperate, clawing hunger. We weren't fighting about indemnity caps. We were fighting about the balcony. We were fighting about the elevator. We were fighting about the fact that for 3 days we had been circling each other like stars collapsing into a black hole, terrified of the impact. Then, abruptly, the words ran out. Cass stared at me, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her eyes were dark, dilated, burning with a frustration that mirrored my own. The silence that followed wasn't the empty silence of a finished argument. It was the deafening, vacuum-sealed silence of a room where all the oxygen had been consumed. I watched her gaze drop to my mouth, then snap back up to my eyes. The hostility in her posture melted into something far more dangerous. She didn't back down. She leaned in further, her weight resting on her palms, invading the sovereign territory of my workspace. "Tell me to leave," she whispered. The command was rough, stripped of all artifice. "Tell me to get out of your office, Elena, right now." My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, bird-like rhythm. I looked at the glass door. Beyond it, the office hummed with the mundane activity of 50 employees. Phones ringing, printers whirring, people living their safe, predictable lives. I didn't tell her to leave. I walked around the desk. My legs felt heavy, like I was moving through water. I went to the door. I didn't open it. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and turned the lock. Click. The sound was small, mechanical, insignificant. But in the quiet of the room, it sounded like a gunshot. It was the sound of a bridge burning. I turned back to her. Cass hadn't moved, but her expression had shattered. The defiance was gone, replaced by a raw, naked want that terrified me. I walked toward her. I didn't stop at the safe distance. I didn't stop at the professional distance. I walked until I was standing inside her orbit, close enough to see the gold flecks in her iris, close enough to feel the heat radiating from her body. "I can't," I breathed. She made a sound, half sigh, half whimper, and closed the final inch. She didn't kiss me. Not yet. She brought her hand up, her fingers hovering just millimeters from my cheek, trembling. The anticipation was a physical ache, a tightening wire in my gut. I could feel the warmth radiating from her skin, overwhelming and intoxicating. I watched her pupils dilate as she traced the line of my jaw without making contact, the air between us charging with static. Then her hand landed. Warm, solid, real. Her thumb brushed across my cheekbone, a touch so reverence-filled it made my knees weak. I leaned into it, my eyes fluttering shut, my own hands finding purchase on the lapels of her jacket. The wool was rough under my fingertips, a grounding texture in a world that was spinning out of control. "Elena," she murmured, her forehead resting against mine. We stood there in the center of the office, the blinds open to the world, but the door locked against it, breathing the same air. It wasn't a kiss. It was worse. It was the total, catastrophic surrender of the one thing I had sworn to protect. I wasn't safe anymore. And God help me, I didn't want to be. We didn't talk about what happened in my office. We didn't have to. The shift in our reality was immediate and absolute, like a stock market correction that revalues every asset overnight. We had become insider traders in the currency of intimacy, hoarding a secret that could bankrupt us both if it ever went public. My life, once a seamless grid of transparent glass and billable hours, fractured into two distinct timelines: the public performance of indifference and the private, suffocating heat of what lay beneath. In the boardroom, nothing changed on the surface. We still sat at opposite ends of the mahogany table. I still challenged her risk assessments. She still critiqued my conservatism. But the subtext had evolved into a language only we spoke. When she tapped her pen against a file, it wasn't impatience, it was a signal. When I adjusted my glasses and looked over the rim at her, it wasn't scrutiny, it was a caress. My phone would buzz against the wood of the table, a single vibration. "Check the data room," the text would say. But the code was simple. "I need to be near you." We found spaces in the architecture of the firm that the cameras didn't reach. The fire stairwell on the 38th floor became our sanctuary. It was a cold, industrial space, smelling of concrete dust and floor wax, echoing with the distant hum of the ventilation systems. We wouldn't speak. We would just stand there in the heavy silence, the heavy door clicked shut behind us. We stood close enough that the fabric of her suit jacket brushed against my arm, close enough that I could hear the change in her breathing when I looked at her. It was a torture of our own making. We didn't kiss in the building. That was the line we drew, the last vestige of my control. But the restraint was more intimate than the act itself. Her hand would graze mine as we passed a file back and forth, her pinky finger hooking around my wrist for a fraction of a second, hidden by the cover of a folder. That fleeting contact carried more voltage than a downed power line. It left my skin burning for hours, a phantom sensation that made it impossible to focus on the merger documents in front of me. But the real danger wasn't in the stairwells. It was in the mornings. Waking up in her apartment felt like stepping into a different universe. Cass's home was nothing like her office persona. It was warm, cluttered with books and soft textures, smelling of roasted coffee beans and old paper. Seeing her there, before the armor went on, was a revelation that terrified me. I watched her stand in her kitchen, wearing an oversized t-shirt, holding a ceramic mug with both hands like it was something precious. Her hair was messy, her eyes soft with sleep. She wasn't the shark from London. She was just a woman who made terrible toast and hummed while the coffee brewed. "You're staring," she'd murmur, not turning around. "I'm assessing liabilities," I'd lie, leaning against the doorframe, my own defenses stripped away by the morning light. Then came the afternoon in the archive room. It was buried in the basement, a maze of floor-to-ceiling metal shelving units filled with decades of dead deals. We were down there looking for a precedent on the Kensington merger, or at least that was the excuse. The aisles were narrow, creating a forced proximity that made the air feel thin. We were standing in the back corner, shadowed by boxes of tax returns from 1998. Cass had stepped into my space, her voice dropping to a whisper as she made a joke about a failed acquisition. The silence of the basement was absolute, wrapping around us like a blanket. I leaned back against the metal shelving, the cold steel pressing into my spine through my blouse. Cass was close, her hand resting on the shelf next to my head, boxing me in. We weren't touching, but the magnetic pull was so strong, I felt dizzy with it. I watched her gaze drop to my lips, the intent clear, the air between us crackling with the static of imminent collision. Click-clack. Click-clack. The sound was sharp, distinct, and terrifying. Footsteps. Hard-soled shoes hitting the concrete floor. We froze. The air left my lungs in a rush. Cass didn't pull away immediately. Her eyes widened, locking onto mine in a moment of shared panic. The footsteps were getting closer, a rhythmic march down the main aisle. Click-clack. Someone was 2 rows away. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. If a junior analyst turned the corner and saw us, saw the flush on my neck, the way Cass was leaning over me, the undeniable intimacy of the stance, it was over. There would be no explaining this away. Cass moved first. With a fluid, silent motion, she pulled a heavy box from the shelf, creating a physical barrier between us. She opened it, burying her attention in a stack of dusty files. I turned away, grabbing a binder at random, my hands shaking so hard I could barely read the label. "Is someone back here?" a voice called out. It was Greg, from compliance, of course. "Just pulling the 04 audit logs," Cass called back. Her voice was steady, bored even, a masterclass in deception. "Elena's walking me through the precedent." Greg rounded the corner. He looked at Cass, then at me. I forced my spine straight, channeling every ounce of cold authority I possessed. "We're almost done, Greg. Do you need the room?" He hesitated, his eyes flickering between us. For a second, I thought he saw it, the lingering heat, the guilt. Then he shrugged. "Just looking for the lighting controls." "Carry on." He walked away. The footsteps faded. Click-clack. Click. Clack. Silence. When the door to the stairwell clicked shut, I slumped against the shelving unit, my knees turning to water. Cass let out a breath that sounded like a curse. We looked at each other, the adrenaline still spiking in our blood. We were safe, for now. But the fear was a cold knot in my stomach. We were playing a game with infinite stakes, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure I could control the outcome. The crisis arrived with a quiet, devastating email at 4 p.m. on a Friday. The Kensington deal was dead on arrival. A regulatory oversight in the due diligence files had been flagged by the SEC. A misdisclosure on a subsidiary's debt load turned a $1 billion acquisition into a federal investigation. In the high-altitude world of Sterling and Vance, when money evaporates, someone has to bleed for it. The emergency board meeting was called for 8 a.m. on Saturday. The conference room felt like a tribunal. The morning light was gray and unforgiving, washing out the faces of the 5 managing partners who sat at the head of the table like judges at an execution. Cass sat alone on one side, her posture rigid, hands clasped on the table in a white-knuckled grip. She wasn't wearing her usual armor. She looked tired. She looked cornered. "The timestamp on the disclosure review is 11:45 p.m. on Tuesday," Vance said, his voice quiet and lethal. He slid a piece of paper across the polished mahogany. "You were the lead on that file, Cass. The file was open on your terminal, but the flag was ignored. You were logged in, but you weren't looking. Were you distracted?" The word distracted hung in the air like smoke. It was an accusation of incompetence, suggesting her chaotic style had finally cost the firm its reputation. I sat 3 seats away, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I knew exactly where Cass was at 11:45 p.m. on Tuesday. She had been in my office. We had been arguing about the indemnity cap, an argument that had ended with the lock turning and the world narrowing down to the heat of her skin and the desperate, silent press of our foreheads together. The file was open, but she hadn't been looking at the screen. She had been looking at me. Cass didn't speak. She looked at the paper, then briefly flicked her eyes to me. The message was clear. She was going to take the fall. She was going to let them gut her career to keep my name out of the wreckage. She knew that if she provided an alibi, if she said she was with me, the questions would start. Why were you in Elena's office with the door locked? Why was the senior partner not supervising the file? I take full responsibility, Cass said, her voice steady but hollow. It was an oversight. It was negligence, Vance corrected sharply. And at this level, negligence is a termination event. The room seemed to tilt. I looked at Cass, the set of her jaw, the resignation in her shoulders. She was protecting me. The woman who challenged me was willing to walk out of this building forever to keep my pedestal intact. I couldn't breathe. The silence in the room was a guillotine waiting to drop. If I stayed quiet, I survived. I kept my perfect record. I kept my control. But I would lose her.
It wasn't negligence, I said.
The words came out louder than I intended. 5 heads snapped toward me. Cass froze. I stood up, smoothing my skirt with hands that were trembling. I walked to the head of the table, picking up the log sheet. Cass didn't miss the flag because she was distracted. She missed it because I pulled her off the terminal to review the structural indemnity clauses. We were vetting the liability cap manually. Vance narrowed his eyes. At midnight? The deal required midnight hours, I lied smoothly, leaning into the authority I'd spent a decade cultivating. I ordered the review. If the digital flag was missed, it's because I prioritized the physical contract. The error is procedural, and it falls under my supervision. I was offering a trade. Fire a new partner for negligence, or accept a procedural reprimand for their top earner. I was betting my entire career on the fact that I was too valuable to lose. Vance stared at me for a long, agonizing minute. He looked from me to Cass, his eyes sharp, calculating. He saw something, a flicker of the current that ran between us, the undeniable weight of my defense. He knew I was lying, or at least that I wasn't telling the whole truth. But he also knew the quarterly projections. Fine, Vance said finally, tossing his pen onto the table. We frame it as a procedural error. But this goes in both your files. And Elena, keep your team on a shorter leash. The meeting disbanded. We survived, but the air between us had shifted violently. As the room cleared, leaving us alone in the wreckage, Cass didn't look relieved. She looked devastated. I had saved her job, but in doing so, I had exposed the one thing I could never take back. I had chosen her over the firm. And now, they were watching. The week following the board meeting was a vacuum. We didn't speak. We worked in parallel lines that never intersected, the silence between our desks thick with unsaid apologies. I had saved her job, but I had broken the cardinal rule of our arrangement. I had made it real. The data was irrefutable. I couldn't be the cold strategist anymore, not when I was willing to burn my own capital to keep her in the room. Cass looked at me like I was a stranger, or worse, a savior she hadn't asked for. The office felt sterile, the air conditioning humming a lonely, monochromatic tune. I sat in my glass box, staring at the quarterly projections, feeling the absence of her interruption like a physical ache. The tapping of her pen, the maddening hum of her energy, it was all gone, replaced by an efficiency that felt like death. I showed up at her apartment on a Thursday. It was raining, a relentless gray drizzle that slicked the city streets, turning the world into a blurred watercolor. I didn't call first. I just stood at her door, dripping wet, clutching a bottle of expensive red wine like a peace offering. When she opened the door, she looked tired. She was wearing a sweatshirt that was too big for her hair pulled back in a severe, unpolished knot. She didn't invite me in immediately. She just blocked the doorway, her body a barrier. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice rough, stripped of its usual confidence. "Vance is watching us. One misstep and they'll strip you of the senior partner title. You know the bylaws." "Let him watch," I said. The words felt heavy, solid. I stepped forward, forcing her to step back into the warmth of the hallway. I spent 10 years building a fortress, Cass. I spent 10 years making sure nothing could touch me, ensuring every asset was liquid and every risk was hedged. And in one meeting, I realized I'd rather be exposed with you than safe by myself. "It's messy, Elena," she warned, leaning against the wall, crossing her arms as if to physically hold herself together. "I'm messy. This. Us. It's a liability. You hate liabilities." I did, I admitted. I set the wine down on the entry table, the glass clinking softly in the quiet apartment. But I'm done with zero liabilities. I want the risk. I want the argument about the indemnity cap. I want the Thai food on the floor at midnight. I want the mess. The tension broke. It didn't snap. It melted, slow and viscous. Cass exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to carry the weight of the entire week. The distance between us collapsed. She didn't kiss me, not yet. She reached out and took my hand, her thumb tracing the pulse point at my wrist, grounding me. Her skin was warm, a stark contrast to the rain on my coat. "We don't hide anymore," she whispered, her eyes searching mine for any sign of hesitation. "If we do this, we do it for real, even if it means one of us leaves, even if it burns down." "Let it burn," I answered. "I'll handle the ashes." Monday morning looked different. We walked into the lobby of Sterling & Vance together. We didn't touch, we weren't reckless, but we moved in orbit, a binary star system that couldn't be separated. The air didn't feel thin anymore. We walked through the security gates, badges flashing, united by the secret knowledge that we had negotiated the only deal that actually mattered. The glass walls didn't look like a cage anymore. They looked like a view. The elevator ride up was quiet. But this time, the silence wasn't pressurized. It was settled. As the numbers climbed, 38, 39, 40, Cass's hand found mine. Not a graze, but a grip. Fingers interlaced, hidden between our bodies, a secret held tight against the steel. The doors opened. We stepped out, ready.
If you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more.